Last night I was able to have the interview with the psychologist, Dr. Gerhard, as he'd like to be known. It was an extremely interesting discussion. It was a little bit on the long side for one recording, but I've included the entire recording here. Unfortunately, we did have a weak internet signal, so I've had to edit the audio quite a bit. We had a lot of gaps in the audio which I cut out, and so you might find the odd word that quite doesn't sound right, and right near the end there was a space where a couple of words went missing. But all in all, the audio is plenty good enough to listen to and extremely interesting. I would like everybody, every single person who hears or who listens to this, to take extreme note of what Gerhard is saying here. It gives a perfect explanation of why the whites in this country are so, I don't know what the right word is now, just reluctant to do anything, reluctant to act out of the norm, because you will hear Gerhard explain when he talks about mass hysteria and following the crowd, following the herd. That is exactly what we are doing. We are watching our neighbors. We are seeing that our neighbor is doing nothing and his neighbor is doing nothing, so we do nothing as well. We don't want to stick out. We don't want to be the thumb that sticks out above the crowd. So please, I'm asking that everybody listen to this audio. It's a little bit on the long side, as I said, but man, we need to take in what this man is saying to us and understand what is going on in our minds before we make decisions. This is an extremely important thing that we need to learn to do, is to recognize emotional decisions and replace them with rational ones. That's the biggest thing we face, the biggest hurdle we face anyway. So here's the audio. Enjoy. Any questions, you're welcome to send me via email. I know I do get a lot of emails, and some of you will have sent me an email and not got a reply. If you need a reply from me, please ask for it. I do try to reply to direct questions to me, but I know there's some of you that just send me a lot of information, maybe a link to a video somewhere or a link to an article somewhere. The name Janine comes to mind. I do get all your emails, I do read them, and I do see the information that you send me, but I don't find it necessary, and I don't have the time to reply to every single one unless it's a direct question to me asking for whatever, information or whatever. So here's the audio now. Enjoy. This is the recording with Dr. Gerhard, the psychologist, who happens to be a PhD, and well, he has 5 degrees in the subject, so I think he's more than qualified to give us information and to tell us exactly what we are suffering from in this country as the white minority. Gerhard, ek wil vir jou baie dankie sê dat jy vanaand uitgekom het en bereid is om op my kanaal te wees. Maar sal jy omgee as ons die onderhoud in Engels doen? Dit is 'n internasionale kanaal en ek wil hê die mense buite moet hierdie storie hoor.
Baie dankie. Ja, nee, dit is 100% met my so.
Okay, Gerhard. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what your qualifications are? What makes you qualified to come and speak to us tonight?
I have 5 degrees in human behavioral sciences, amongst which is a PhD from the University of Pretoria. I'm a phenomenologist, which is the science that studies mass behavior and group thinking, ideologies and spiritual and religious movements. My fields of research included modern neuro and cognitive sciences and also evolutionary psychology. Professionally, I have mostly applied my knowledge in the fields of business strategy, consumer behavior, and investing.
That's quite impressive. What made you decide to go into the field of psychology and human behavior initially?
At school, I thought it would be very interesting to figure out what is going on in, literally speaking, behind the scenes of the human mind. And of course also how to attract the attention of the nicest girls.
Well, I suppose there's no better reason than that, eh? I'm fascinated by the attitude of the white population towards what is happening in South Africa and therefore what affects them directly. We have people living in a total oblivion to this imminent threat. Either that or they are not willing to admit that the problem exists. There's probably just denial or apathy on their part. I'd like to know what goes on in these people's heads to make them have this attitude. Another thing I'd like to know is, how is it still possible that there are whites who believe that everything is going to be okay and that there is no danger to them with everything happening around them all day, every day these days? We have another stance taken by whites where they will have the excuse that I'm only one person, what can I do? In other words, they've given up and consider themselves, well, they can only consider themselves to be defeated. What is it that has created this defeatist attitude amongst so many whites or so many of us? How has the white guilt thing managed to take hold so quickly in this country among the younger generations?
Well, before we get to the exploration of the deeper psychology of the white race in South Africa, I would like to start off by making a few general remarks. I think firstly, in South Africa, we are now dealing with the end result of liberal and Marxist indoctrination that occurred over several decades. We know that these people are masters of their art and that they have been working in ways which is not all that obvious to the average person or to the naked eye. Most people do not read a lot and don't have access to the facts. They are therefore not equipped to connect the dots and to see the picture unfolding. I once read that only the mind can see what the eyes cannot. That made a lot of sense to me. Secondly, I think with relation to the questions of white guilt, this is a worldwide phenomenon. The new word for it is ethnomasochism, and it is basically another peak of the same underlying iceberg. As you mentioned, this is mostly observed in the younger generation. Now, politicians and cult leaders and other charlatans have through the ages discovered and mastered the art of controlling groups of people using mostly guilt and fear as driving forces. In my opinion, there's not a lot of so-called white guilt amongst people from my generation. Of course, based on actual historical facts, we really have very little to feel guilty about. But with regard to the apathetic attitude and denial amongst the whites that you refer to, there may be quite obvious reasons for what we observe. Whites are very productive and hard people, while politics is often an endeavor of the idle masses. And whites simply do not have the time to pay a lot of attention to all the bad news and the political developments around them. They also have a culture of minding their own business and taking responsibility for their own lives. So they simply do not have the energy to waste on things they believe that they can do little about. And whites in South Africa are also from a Protestant background and inherently good-hearted people. We live in good faith and abide by the law and trust what they are being told. It is exactly these traits which make them so easy to exploit. All over the world, the Christian live and let live attitude and the wealth that they have built up over centuries is being exploited and raided by third world and Muslim countries. So it is not only a phenomenon occurring in South Africa. And lastly, our younger white generation have been brought up in a cocoon of comfort and never had exposure to violence or war like the previous generation have. They are simply naive about it. A young man recently told me, "We don't want war." I explained to him that history does not care what you want or not. There has never been a single century we know about without war. You may not be interested in war, I told him, but war is definitely interested in you, because freedom is never free.
Interesting. I've noticed the tendency of the white middle class to pay even more attention to their jobs and work, even harder as things get worse these days. I would imagine that this is in itself also a coping mechanism employed by them to distract themselves from the reality and severity of the situation. Is there any interesting things that you would like to discuss that you think are pertinent to our situation? I know that you have a very extensive analysis of the situation that you would want to share with us. So I'll let you get into it and try not to interrupt you too much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Although the topic of this discussion is the behavior of our own Western white population, I think it's even more important to understand what lies behind the behavior of the African population and the ANC government in South Africa, which may be a very good topic for a next discussion. The reason we analyze the psychology behind mass behavior is in order for us to explain and therefore also to predict and therefore to control or to rectify or to improve the behavior that we observe that could be to our own detriment. So to explain, to predict and to improve, that is also the endeavor of the whole of science as a paradigm. Now, to move to a deeper level psychological explanation or exploration of the matter, evolutionary psychology has quite recently contributed hugely to our understanding of the way that the human brain works and the way it was wired. What gave human beings such a competitive advantage in nature is our special adapted ability of imagination. We can make imaginative leaps and envisage changes to the world that would improve our future. We can also then convince others to work together collectively to execute a plan that would improve our future, although the plan originated in our imagination. But as remarkable as the human brain is, our thinking is also extremely prone to going badly wrong. We more than often make terrible decisions, believe in ridiculous things, ignore evidence right in front of our noses, and come up with ideas that make absolutely no sense. So one of the biggest myths of human behavior is that we are rational beings. In true fact, we are not rational beings, sometimes acting emotionally. We are emotional beings who sometimes act rationally. The human brain did not evolve to be a smart thinking machine. It evolved solely to help us survive. And for that reason, our brains are actually pretty dumb and our operating systems are woefully outdated for the complex world that we now live in. It is also easily tricked. Like those of our animal cousins, most of our behavioral patterns were hardwired into our genes. Our behavior can therefore be extremely predictable and for those who understand it, also very exploitable. In order to save energy and to make faster decisions, our brains developed many shortcuts for jumping to conclusions and making fast decisions. These mental shortcuts are called cognitive heuristics. Most of our behavioral responses are made on autopilot or subconsciously, fast auto-thinking and emotional auto-responding. Now that stems from our evolutionary prehistory. Life was way simpler back when our emotional circuitry was wired and the decisions we had to make to survive on a daily basis was much simpler than it is today. It did not require a lot of mental processing, for instance, to observe a saber-toothed tiger, to be aware of the fact that it was a dangerous animal and to decide that it was time to run. So it became an auto-response hardwired into our nervous systems and driven by an emotion that we experience as fear. Now, unfortunately, now that life has become much more complex, we are still stuck with our hardwired, quite primitive mental programs, which have now become a real hurdle to proper thinking and often leads us down the wrong path. Now, these responses are called cognitive biases or impulsive tendencies and is constantly tricking us into making dumb decisions. At the Harvard Business School, it was determined that as many as 6 out of 10 decisions we make are based on emotion and are therefore inferior compared to rational decisions. It is also important to know that people with sinister motives like clever salespeople and cult leaders, politicians and ideologists who discovered these biases have learned how to turn us into patsies and exploit us because of the predictability of these responses. Worst of all, our own brains are probably our worst enemies, causing us to believe things or buying into schemes that is often to our own detriment.
So basically what you are saying is that we have some basic responses that we can call natural or instinctive responses that do not require us to analyze the situation before deciding how we will react to it.
Exactly. This is called fast thinking or emotional or impulsive responses, as opposed to slow, rational, cognitive thinking and weighed behavior, which is not our natural inclination or the so-called route of least resistance. I think it was Einstein who said that thinking is the hardest work there is. That is why so few people endeavor into it. Our desire to understand the world means we spend a lot of time convincing ourselves that the world works in a particular way, when in fact it can be completely wrong. We build up an internal picture or an internal map of reality. And this can encompass everything from small personal superstitions to completely inaccurate beliefs, and explain why we fall for propaganda and fake news so readily. The real fun starts when somebody manages to convince large numbers of people that a particular pet theory about the world is true, which gives us ideology, politics, religious cults, and all the other big ideas that have proved so entertaining over the course of human history. Now, by the way, belief systems spread in exactly the same way as viruses, and is in fact called viruses of the mind.
You mentioned that the fun starts when someone comes along and convinces us that something quite ridiculous is true. In your professional opinion, what criteria do you think makes some people more susceptible to this than others? Does intelligence, education, and IQ perhaps have anything to do with it?
Well, modern cognitive science has any doubt that our inherited IQ, or what we these days rather refer to as general cognitive ability, plays the major part in it. The less your natural born ability to use the two frontal brain lobes that we were equipped with, the more you have to rely on emotion or group thinking to make your decisions. Now, people with low cognitive ability act in ways very similar to our animal cousins. So IQ is basically our ability to handle complexity. It is extremely demanding to anticipate and to predict outcomes in highly complex systems, systems like the weather or the economy. Most humans are therefore extremely bad at risk assessment and planning ahead. That is why once we imagined a possible future that pleases us in some way, we'll cheerfully ignore any contrary evidence and refuse to listen to anybody who suggests that we might be wrong. As I have said, we are not the rational beings we tend to believe we are. Many of the so-called cognitive biases have also been observed and studied in our animal cousins and are not at all only a human problem. So learning the major cognitive biases we are under the dominion of will help any person unpack other people's thinking and understand why ordinary people can fall into extreme behaviors. It will help you understand why stock market booms and busts happen, why traders don't sell their shares when they start to lose value, why we buy things that we really don't need, why we get addicted to bad things, why normal seeming people join cults, and why we fall for irrational ideologies and vote for criminals as political leaders. But understanding how easily we are being influenced, controlled, and exploited via these biases, you can also help prevent it from happening to you. It is not what we know that will lead to our downfall, but what we don't know. And we don't know what we don't know. Warren Buffett became the wealthiest investor on the planet, not only for his ability to anticipate economic outcomes in the future, but also of his teamwork with Charlie Munger, who is a specialist on cognitive biases.
You mentioned Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett's teamwork. Could you elaborate on this a bit for the benefit of the listeners, please?
Certainly. I'm in investing, and as part of my personal research, I deconstructed how Warren Buffett makes his investment decisions. I came to a very interesting conclusion about his success as an investor, which is a secret that I may share with you and the listeners. He brought in Charlie Munger, who is a lawyer, a trained lawyer, and also one of the smartest people on the planet, with an IQ of probably around 170, as his vice president. Now, Munger never makes any investment decisions because he is not a numbers person, but he is a master in cognitive sciences and the biases of our minds. And what he does is actually constantly double-checking all Warren Buffett's decisions to make sure that there were no subliminal or emotional influences in the decisions that he made. There are many such cognitive biases already described and studied, most famously by people like the Nobel Prize-winning Professor Daniel Kahneman and also Charlie Munger himself. Many of these biases conspire together to form extremely powerful tendencies and urges that make us feel, think, and act in a particular way. When the individual biases confluence, it leads to extreme consequences, which explains every stupid decision or action that we observe among individuals and populations as a whole, including what we now observe among the white and also the black populations in South Africa. So I will only briefly try to discuss 10 examples of the most obvious biases that explains the behavior of the white population in South Africa. The first one that I would like to refer to is doubt avoidance tendency. Now, doubt is an extremely painful emotion for people, causing a lot of stress. Plotting down your current path is simply psychologically easier than doubting the path and potentially living in stress. So you perpetuate your poor decisions because doubting your current causes more turmoil and internal stress than just continuing on the road that you currently know. So this explains a lot of the white population's current behavior, why they resist accepting the situation that they are in and rather just continue as if nothing happens. Also, the way to solve this problem, what I would call antidotes for this influence, is actually creating awareness. Creating awareness are, in most instances, the most important thing that you can do to become aware of the existence of these tendencies and therefore deliberately be able to avoid it.
Okay. Would you also include education into this? Education as in making a point of knowing as much about what is happening around you as possible, not the type of education you would get at an academic institution, more of knowing what is happening around you in your surroundings.
Exactly. Education or knowledge is nothing else than simply expanding your awareness of things. Now, that is why education can improve the thinking and the decision-making ability for any person of any IQ level. Second cognitive bias I would like to quickly discuss is called pain-avoiding denial. Now, we tend to deny that an objective truth exists because it causes us intense emotional pain. In the psychological sense, denial is a defense mechanism in which a person is faced with a painful fact and rejects the reality of that fact. Now, when a person is in denial, they engage in distractive or escapist strategies to reduce stress and to help them to cope. So it is a coping mechanism that gives you time to adjust to distressing situations. Staying in denial can, of course, interfere with your ability to tackle challenges. If you're in denial, you're trying to protect yourself by refusing to accept the truth about something that is happening in your life. If the truth exists and you refuse to accept it, denial can only worsen your decision-making, and you can tend to blame the external world rather than look at what you contributed to the error or how you can change it. One would tend to wish reality were different, which gets one nowhere. Now, antidotes for denial bias is again to create awareness of the facts. It's actually called exposure therapy to the truth. If you keep repeating the truth to yourself, it will become less painful to accept. To embrace reality and relentlessly seek the truth. You can also reframe the situation in a positive way and ask, for instance, how this painful situation benefits you and what you can learn from it.
Okay, so the South African obsession with the braai and sport, and my favorite example, Seven Dolan on TV, would qualify as a denial mechanism to provide a distraction from the reality of the situation. Would this be a fair comment?
Absolutely. Many of these behaviors are all about escapism. Braai goes together with drinking, which is a drug, helping you forget about the hard realities of life. Now, that is also why we call these activities relaxation. The third cognitive bias I would like to discuss is called inconsistency avoidance tendency. Now, the brain conserves programming space by being reluctant to change. So it does everything to avoid inconsistency or resist changing what we already believe or habits or how we normally do things. We also tend to favor information that confirms our previous assumptions or beliefs. So, in actual fact, we don't believe what we see. Instead, we rather see what we believe. What a man wishes, that also will he believe, is what Augustinus said, the Greek philosopher. So when it comes to our beliefs, repeated exposures to the same belief reinforces it. Making sacrifices will intensify devotion to something as it becomes a habit or a behavioral pattern we are going to resist to change. This, by the way, is one of the strategies that is often used by communists to convert people to communism. People are also reluctant to change their beliefs and their behavior because most are simply stuck in their ways. This explains why it is so hard for many to admit that the dream of a rainbow nation has completely failed. This is also a good example of how the cognitive biases stack up and conspire together. So doubt avoidance tendency causes bad decisions, and then inconsistency avoidance tendency perpetuates those decisions. Now, antidotes for this bias is to always consider counter-arguments to your position before making any decisions. In fact, you should actively seek out opposition to your favorite ideas and stress test your ideas with a trusted group of thinkers. To correct your bad habits, force yourself to act in ways that contradict your beliefs and always do the opposite of what you feel, and you will make much better decisions.
Could you perhaps expand a bit on what you meant by a communist strategy?
One of the techniques that was used in communist jails on enemies of the state was to put them under extreme stress and pressure and then somehow make them to proclaim or state in their own words that I am a communist. Now, after somebody had said that a couple of times, under these circumstances of extreme pressure, the subconscious mind would accept that affirmation and incorporate it into the self-image. After a prisoner stated this, he would be rewarded with food and water and be relieved of the stress, which would make him feel a sudden camaraderie with all of his capturers. In many cases, this would continue to live as a devout communist because of our inherent reluctance to change our beliefs and behaviors. A fourth cognitive bias is called over-optimism tendency because it is much less stressful to believe this way. Believing that things will work out makes you miss all the facts that actually prove the opposite. So combined with the so-called loss aversion bias, which is another cognitive bias, people are willing to take large gambles with very small probabilities of success, like putting all your eggs in one basket and hoping for the best. So denial of bad news and over-optimistic ignorance of risk factors often leads to very poor decision-making. Now, antidotes for this would be admittance of ignorance and also to seek the truth and find the facts. And lastly, to trust nobody.
I know exactly what you were talking about. I actually have some personal experience in this regard, but that is a story for another time. Please carry on.
Certainly. The first cognitive bias I'd like to discuss is called social proof tendency. It's also called mass delusion or social conformity, which is the tendency to follow the crowd. Now, man is a social animal and greatly and automatically influenced by the behavior he observes in people around him. Our ancestors lived in small hierarchies wherein we respected authority and cooperated with members of our own group. We display considerable distrust and dislike people not in our own hierarchy. Our desire to fit in with our group makes us extremely prone to fads and crazes and manias of all kinds of obsessions that grip society and send rationality out of the window. The tendency of herd behavior is triggered most easily in times of puzzlement and stress. This applies to both action and inaction, which is probably a major reason most South African whites are not acting proactively to the threats we face. Everyone is watching their equally inactive neighbors, and so all the frogs are boiling together, because everyone is subject to the same biases, and the one acts as irrationally as the other. In this way, social proof also reinforces the bad behavior in a kind of a death spiral. Now, antidotes for this is, as a society, stop bad behavior before it starts to spread and display proactive behavior to your fellow men. Those with the information or the insight should lead by taking action, and also learn how to ignore the examples from others when you rationally know that they are wrong.
Would the term mass hysteria fall under the category of this, or is this something totally different?
Absolutely. Mass hysteria is herd behavior. So this happens when one individual in the herd gets a fright and starts to run. Then the whole herd will follow him, even if there wasn't any real threat to begin with. Many cattle on the run have disappeared over a cliff altogether. And this is often observed in things like stock market crashes. The sixth cognitive bias I would like to discuss is called contrast misreaction tendency. Now, humans have a very sensitive to observe contrasts, but we tend to underestimate the effect of small differences. If you put your hand in cold water and the other hand in hot water, then you put them both in lukewarm water. The two have different temperatures, despite the fact that they are in the same temperature water. Small imperceptible differences can make a huge difference over time, which is again the boiling frog effect. So for instance, stealing 10% every year from the value of the purchase power of our currency through inflation is one of such contrast misreaction tendency examples. Misleading statistics is also another one. 0.1% risk of death seems much smaller than 8 out of every 1,000 people that will, for instance, die. Now, outrageous policies or even outrageous prices, when it's reduced, will make the policy suddenly seem much more reasonable. So, for instance, the disappropriation of land without compensation idea Should the government at this stage decide that they were going to go ahead with the policy but change it to a small compensation, everyone will most probably be very happy with that. Real estate agents show us 3 overpriced bad houses and then a normally priced house. And then suddenly this normally priced house seems like a big bargain. So that is contrast misreaction tendency. Now, antidotes for this bad influence is to measure everything and never to guesstimate, just thumbsuck the figures. Do the actual maths of the actual figures you are losing instead of just working with percentages, for instance. Convert the real values to compare apples with apples. And then also do the sums, because sums are rational and maths can never lie. And another tendency, the 7th one I would like to discuss, is called stress influence tendency, also called the panic effect. Now, adrenaline-caused stress prompts faster and extreme reactions with less cognitive thinking, planning, and strategizing. You are much more likely to be wrongly influenced or to make poor decisions under pressure or when stressed. Extreme stress or shock can actually and instantly rewire our brains. Compare this with our prior explanation of the communist conversion tactic. So it's very important as an antidote to always try to remain calm, never have to make decisions when under pressure. It's also very helpful to work with worst case scenario, fear setting, very similar to goal setting. Our listeners can actually go and Google about fear setting, which I consider an extremely helpful exercise. You can also use checklists to think through your decisions.
You say that extreme stress may help the rewiring of people. This I find fascinating. Can you give the listeners an example of such a situation?
Certainly. Our neural programming is actually nothing other than being in a hypnotic state. Now, extreme stress or shock can actually wake you up from such a hypnotic state and help you to see the world in a much more realistic light. For the good, people with phobias can, for instance, be cured. Someone who has joined a cult can be converted back. And smoking or drug habits can also be helped. I often kept a glass of cold water handy when doing a counseling session, which I would then use to suddenly throw in the face of a counselee to create a state of shock. Now, this would often instantly break the pattern, the negative neuroassociation or the programmed state, and solve the problem permanently and instantly. Somebody to learn more about this could actually go and Google about neuro-linguistic programming, also called NLP. The 8th cognitive bias I would like to discuss is called availability misweighing tendency. Now, our brain works with what's available to us, and we are being influenced by the most recent information that came to us. Because we have a very limited capacity to remember things, to recall and to think, so we jump to what's the most easily information available to us when we have to make a sudden decision. By using what we have observed or heard most recently, we tend to ignore all other important data or facts. Now, antidotes for this would be to always do proper research and gather all the facts, old facts, good and bad. Seek out the information that is not readily available to you. Talk to many different people and read many different publications about a certain topic before you come to a conclusion, which is basically the way that research works and also that the scientific method have taught us to make much better decisions.
Would this explain what many people suffer from in this country by only giving what they hear on mainstream media any credibility, when in fact it is the mainstream media that is pulling the wool over our eyes with fake and sifted news?
This is an excellent example. We don't tend to make an effort to search for or research the actual facts, but will make decisions based on Facebook rumors or asking unqualified people's opinions simply because it is the easiest route available to us. The ninth cognitive bias I would like to discuss is SENESCENSE misinfluence tendency. Now, this is about people when they get older. Old people find it more difficult to learn new things and new skills. Our brains prune the circuits that are more successful over life. As you age, consistency bias and status quo bias will fix your beliefs. Your personality and thinking becomes less plastic. It gets harder to change old people's habits, especially in the face of new evidence. As our white population is actually growing older, we also tend to become more fixated in our ways and less responsive to the new conditions around us.
I guess that is where the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks comes from then.
I think it is even more difficult to teach a young dog old tricks.
Okay.
The 10th and the last cognitive bias I would like to discuss is called authority misinfluence tendency, or so-called conformism. Man was born mostly to follow leaders, with only a few strong people doing the leading. Now, hierarchies arise that support this tendency. People tend to follow instructions from authority, even completely blindly. Authority limits the individual's decision-making, which makes him open to be wrongly influenced, especially when the leader himself is wrong or when the leader's ideas are misunderstood. Examples of this is when cult leaders, for instance, have led good, honest people to commit suicide, and many have actually led normal people into genocide. In 2014, a ferry capsized and 300 passengers died because the captain asked the passengers to stay in their cabins and await further orders. Now, the captain left the ship and no further orders came. Antidotes for authority misinfluence tendency would be to be very careful whom you appoint as a leader or who you consider to be your leader. Select intelligent leaders and not emotional leaders. Verify the leader's judgment and check your own thinking. If you're defaulting to this tendency, for instance saying, well, this policeman or this professor or this manager actually said so.
I find this to be so prevalent in our society today. I hear kids say, well, he said I must do it. You see the masses of uneducated black people in this country mostly following leaders who quite literally have no idea what they are doing, but follow their instructions simply because they are in a position of perceived leadership or authority. I've even seen on social media how some so-called followers even ask their so-called leaders for instructions to carry out certain acts.
This, of course, is even worse under masses of uneducated and desperately poor people. I would say another formula that have proved so entertaining over the course of human history. I would like to end this off by discussing an example of how cognitive biases conspire together. We find ourselves in South Africa in could be described as Stockholm syndrome. It's also called disambiguation. That white minorities in South Africa are technically being held hostage by the current political regime, mostly for our economic means. From a psychological perspective, this condition is referred to as the Stockholm syndrome. It is also a good example of how several cognitive biases conspire together to create accepting the situation. The Stockholm syndrome refers to a condition which causes hostages to develop a psychological alliance, even in an emotional bond with their captors. The term was first used by the media in 1973 when 4 hostages were taken during a bank robbery in Stockholm. The hostages defended their captors after being released and would not agree to testify in court against them. Now, this condition is explained as a survival strategy during captivity, and of course is considered irrational in the light of the suffering and the danger that the victims endured. It also explains the actions of abuse victims. Actions and attitudes similar to those suffering from Stockholm Syndrome proved and found in victims of physical and sexual abuse, in human trafficking, and of course in political oppression currently indeed.
I've seen this condition manifest in children before, where they protect an abusive parent at all costs, even to their own detriment at the end of the day. I've also noticed a very strong attitude amongst white people, particularly the younger generation, adults here in their 30s or so today, of total defeat. They seem to have accepted that they are powerless and not able to do anything to change the situation. It is as if their own experience in life has brought them to the conclusion that all is lost and there is nothing they can do about it, when we, as the older generations, tend to think totally differently to them. My question to you is, do whites in South Africa have a defeatist attitude? Do they consider themselves just beaten down? Are they defeated?
I can only speak on behalf of people from my own generation who were all soldiers in the old South African military. I actually experienced exactly the opposite of a defeatist attitude from people of my generation. Most of them are very much ready and willing to stand up against the threat we face. Current levels of preparation and organization may not be up to standard yet, but history has proven that we have the intelligence and the ability to get our act together very quickly. I think most people are completely underestimating how ingenious and resourceful we are as a group, and underrate our ability to defend ourselves should it become necessary. We have not been in power for a quarter of a century, and thus we have not had the ability or the opportunity to develop our leadership. We may therefore look leaderless and disorganized, but under the selective pressures of survival in this very brutal part of the world, we have evolved to be an extremely resilient group of people with an inherent ability to organize ourselves, to cooperate effectively, and fight with deadly intent when the need for it arises.
Gerhard, this has been a very interesting conversation. I could go on for ages talking about this topic. One thing is for sure, if we as a white minority want to survive and have any kind of future in this country, that is, if we don't realize exactly what is happening to us very soon and decide to stand up together and do something decisive about it, we might as well pack our bags and leave with our tails between our legs. The younger generation adults need to know, or they need to realize, that they are truly capable, or what they are truly capable of. They need to see what their true identity is and where their roots come from. What we have discussed here is only the tip of the iceberg though. So I would like to have you back on my channel soon again to delve a little deeper into the psychology of people exposed to this type of stresses as we are in this country. I'd like to thank you for volunteering to come onto my channel and sharing your knowledge with us today. Is there a parting thought you would like to end this chat with?
Certainly. Thank you very much for your contribution to the creation of awareness about the very dangerous gamble that the ANC government is currently taking with the future of our country and millions of its citizens. It should be obvious to everyone now that the building of a rainbow nation was never their true intent, but rather the destruction of our Western culture and civilization and the opportunistic exploitation of the resources established here over centuries. They have proven once again that a multinational democracy cannot work in a country with such diverse and incompatible cultures. To give our people some hope, I would like to remind them that every crisis brings with it massive opportunities for which we should be very grateful. When life hands you lemons, make lemonade out of it. The current situation in the country is offering us the opportunity to reunite our people, to reinforce our cultural values, and it gives us the purpose to mobilize ourselves for self-determination. We are fit for the challenge, and like in the past, we will arise from it much stronger than before. But for the foreseeable future, the greatest risk will be not taking any risk at all.
Wow, powerful words. Gerhard, thank you very much. Much appreciate your time. I know you're in a hurry to get back to your appointment tonight. I will have this up on YouTube as soon as I can get it edited and fixed up and ready for distribution. Thank you very much.